While the world watches Donald Trump threaten Denmark with tariffs and military force over Greenland, while European nations scramble their troops to the Arctic, while protesters fill the streets of Nuuk chanting that their island is not for sale, something far more dangerous is happening in the shadows. The real battle for Greenland isn't being fought with aircraft carriers or trade sanctions. It's being won with quiet investments, patient diplomacy, and a strategy so subtle that most Americans don't even know it's happening. And the country winning this battle isn't flying F-35s over Greenlandic fjords. It's China. While America makes threats, China makes deals. While Washington burns bridges with Denmark, Beijing builds them with Nuuk. And by the time the United States realizes what's happened, it may already be too late. This is the story of how China is quietly winning the Arctic War while America loudly loses it, and why Greenland's future looks a lot more red than stars and stripes. To understand why China is positioned to win Greenland, you first need to understand what Greenland actually represents in 21st century geopolitics. This isn't just about an ice-covered island with 57,000 people. Greenland sits at the epicenter of three converging crises that will define global power for the next century: the rare earth minerals crisis, the Arctic shipping revolution, and the new Cold War between superpowers. Let's start with the minerals. Beneath Greenland's ice sheet lies one of the world's largest untapped reserves of rare earth elements, the 17 metallic elements that are absolutely critical to modern technology. We're talking about neodymium for wind turbines and electric vehicle motors, dysprosium for permanent magnets, europium for LED screens, and at least a dozen other elements that make your smartphone, your laptop, your electric car, and your military's guided missiles actually function. Here's the problem that keeps Pentagon strategists awake at night. China currently controls approximately 90% of the global rare earth processing capacity. Not mining, processing. Even rare earths mined in America get shipped to China for processing, because nobody else has invested in the complex, expensive, and environmentally challenging refinement infrastructure. This gives Beijing a stranglehold on the entire global technology supply chain. But Greenland could change everything. Geological surveys suggest the island may contain some of the world's richest deposits of these critical minerals, and unlike most rare earth deposits, many of Greenland's are relatively close to the surface and near coastlines, making them economically viable to extract. The Kvanefjeld deposit alone contains enough uranium, rare earths, and zinc to potentially shift global supply chains. For America, gaining control of Greenland means breaking China's monopoly. But here's what Trump and his advisors seem to have missed. China doesn't need to control Greenland politically to control its resources economically. And that's exactly the strategy Beijing has been executing for the past decade while Washington wasn't paying attention. Then there's the Arctic shipping equation. Climate change, regardless of your politics, is physically opening new shipping routes through the Arctic Ocean. The Northern Sea Route along Russia's coast and the Northwest Passage through Canadian waters could eventually cut shipping times between Asia and Europe by up to 40% compared to the Suez Canal route. Greenland sits at the strategic gateway to these routes. Whoever controls Greenland effectively controls access to the Arctic Ocean, and with it, trillions of dollars in annual trade flows. China has explicitly declared itself a near-Arctic nation, despite being nowhere near the Arctic, and has invested heavily in Arctic shipping infrastructure, icebreakers, and what it calls its Polar Silk Road. So how exactly is China winning Greenland? The answer reveals a level of strategic patience and sophistication that makes America's current approach look like a toddler throwing a tantrum in a geopolitical chess match. China's Greenland strategy operates on three parallel tracks: economic penetration, diplomatic cultivation, and strategic positioning. Let's break down each one, because this is a masterclass in modern, great power competition that most Americans have no idea is even happening. First, the economic penetration. China has been quietly investing in Greenland for over 15 years, long before Trump ever mentioned the island. In 2009, Chinese mining company Jilin GN Nickel Industry invested in Greenland's nickel and copper deposits. In 2016, General Nice Group, a Chinese mining consortium, attempted to purchase an abandoned naval base in Greenland to develop it into a mining support facility. That deal ultimately fell through due to Danish government pressure. More on that in a moment, but it established Chinese interest and presence. More importantly, Chinese companies have funded geological surveys, feasibility studies, and infrastructure assessments across Greenland. They've offered to build 3 airports in Greenland, in Nuuk, Ilulissat, and Qaqortoq, as part of Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure projects. Now, Denmark ultimately blocked that airport deal in 2018 after pressure from the United States. But here's what matters. China made the offer. China was willing to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to connect Greenland to international trade routes and make its economy viable. And while Denmark said no, Greenlanders themselves were enthusiastic about the proposal because they desperately need infrastructure investment. This creates a wedge, a point of friction between Greenland's economic needs and Denmark's geopolitical fears. And China is absolutely brilliant at exploiting these wedges. Look at what happened with the Kvanefjeld mining project. Australian company Greenland Minerals spent years trying to develop this massive rare earth deposit in southern Greenland. The project required enormous capital investment, faced significant environmental concerns, and needed patient, long-term funding. Chinese company Shenghe Resources, one of China's largest rare earth processors, became a major shareholder in Greenland Minerals and provided crucial funding. The project ultimately stalled in 2021 when Greenland's parliament banned uranium mining, which would have been a byproduct of the rare earth extraction. But here's the key point. Chinese capital was willing to invest in a decades-long mining project in one of the world's most challenging environments. That's not speculation or quick profit. That's strategic positioning. Meanwhile, what was America doing? Largely ignoring Greenland until Trump casually mentioned buying it in 2019, an idea that was immediately rejected and mocked internationally. The United States reopened a consulate in Nuuk in 2020, which is good, but that's a diplomatic gesture, not an economic strategy. America has offered some development assistance and security cooperation, but nothing remotely approaching the scale of investment that China has been willing to deploy. Now let's talk about diplomatic cultivation, because this is where China's strategy gets really sophisticated. Beijing understands something that Washington seems to have forgotten. Greenland isn't actually interested in being controlled by anyone. Greenland's political class, across the spectrum, is focused on one primary goal: independence from Denmark. Not sovereignty transfer to America or China, but actual independence. Greenland has been moving toward independence for decades. It achieved home rule in 1979 and expanded self-governance in 2009. The island controls its own domestic affairs, natural resources, and police force, but Denmark still handles defense and foreign policy. Most importantly, Denmark provides an annual block grant of about $650 million, roughly 60% of Greenland's government budget. This subsidy is the main obstacle to full independence. Greenland simply cannot afford to be independent unless it develops its own economy, which means mining, fishing, and tourism. China grasps this dynamic completely. Beijing doesn't approach Greenland saying, "We want to control you," or "You should fear Russia." Instead, Chinese officials and companies approach Greenlandic leaders saying, "We can help you achieve economic independence, which will enable political independence." This is the same playbook China has used successfully across Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. China offers infrastructure investment, mining development, and economic partnership with no visible political strings attached, at least initially. Of course, there are always strings attached, but they're subtle, long-term, and built into economic dependency rather than explicit political control. When a Chinese company funds your airport, processes your rare earth minerals, and finances your infrastructure, you become economically dependent on Chinese supply chains, Chinese markets, and Chinese goodwill. You don't need to sign a treaty ceding sovereignty. You just gradually align your interest with Beijing's because that's where your economic lifeline flows. This is precisely what's happening across the developing world, and Greenland, despite being European associated, is effectively a developing economy seeking independence. It's the perfect target for China's economic statecraft. Now contrast China's approach with what America is currently doing, and you'll see exactly why Beijing is winning this competition. Donald Trump's Greenland strategy, such as it is, consists of three main elements: threatening to buy Greenland through what amounts to a real estate deal, suggesting he might use military force if Denmark doesn't comply, and now imposing tariffs on 8 European countries, including America's closest allies, to pressure Denmark into selling. Let's examine why every single element of this approach is strategically counterproductive and actually pushes Greenland closer to Chinese influence. First, the purchase proposal itself. Trump has repeatedly framed Greenland as essentially a large real estate deal and suggested paying each Greenlander $100,000 as compensation for acquisition. Setting aside the staggering arrogance of suggesting you can buy human beings' homeland, this approach fundamentally misunderstands what Greenlanders actually want. Greenland doesn't want to be purchased. It doesn't want to trade one colonial relationship with Denmark for another colonial relationship with America. Greenlandic politicians across the political spectrum have been absolutely clear. They want independence, not a new master. Public opinion polls show 85% of Greenlanders oppose becoming part of the United States. When you approach a people seeking independence by offering to buy them like a piece of property, you're not presenting an attractive partnership. You're demonstrating exactly the kind of imperial arrogance they're trying to escape. This approach actually strengthens Danish-Greenlandic ties because suddenly Denmark looks like the defender of Greenlandic autonomy against American imperialism. China, meanwhile, doesn't talk about buying Greenland. Chinese officials talk about mutually beneficial partnerships and supporting Greenlandic development. Even if that's ultimately just as self-interested as American goals, it's diplomatically sophisticated and respects Greenlandic agency in a way Trump's approach absolutely doesn't. Second, the military threat. Trump and his officials have repeatedly refused to rule out military force to take Greenland. The president has said he'll do it the easy way through a deal, but if that doesn't work, he'll do it the hard way. Secretary of State Marco Rubio confirmed that military options remain on the table. Think about what this means. The United States is threatening military action against an island that is part of Denmark, a founding member of NATO and one of America's oldest allies. Denmark has been a loyal NATO partner for 75 years, contributed troops to every major American military operation from Afghanistan to Iraq, and hosts crucial American military assets. And now America is threatening to invade Danish territory. The strategic insanity of this position cannot be overstated. If the United States actually used military force against a NATO ally, it would instantly destroy the Atlantic alliance that has been the cornerstone of American global power since World War II. Every country on Earth would conclude that American security guarantees are worthless and that the United States is an unreliable, aggressive power that attacks its own allies. American credibility would be shattered permanently. China and Russia would gain an unbelievable propaganda victory, and the entire liberal international order that America built would collapse. And for what? To seize an island whose population despises you and whose resources you could have accessed through normal diplomatic and economic channels. The sheer short-sighted stupidity of this approach is breathtaking. But here's what makes it even worse. The military threat isn't even credible. America is not going to invade Greenland. The political, diplomatic, economic, and military costs would be catastrophic. European leaders know this. Greenlandic leaders know this. And most importantly, Chinese leaders know this. So Trump's threats don't project strength. They project weakness disguised as bluster. They reveal an administration that has no actual strategy beyond making noise and hoping someone capitulates. Meanwhile, China watches this circus and adjusts its own approach. Every American threat pushes Greenlandic public opinion further away from Washington. Every time Trump talks about taking Greenland, whether they like it or not, Greenlandic independence leaders become more skeptical of American partnership. Every tariff imposed on Denmark makes European governments less willing to cooperate with American security priorities in the Arctic. China doesn't need to do anything. America is defeating itself. Now let's talk about the tariffs, because this might be the most counterproductive element of Trump's entire approach. On January 18th, literally yesterday, Trump announced 10% tariffs on 8 European countries, including Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland. These tariffs will rise to 25% by June 1st, unless Denmark agrees to sell Greenland. Think about the strategic logic here. Trump is punishing America's closest allies, the very countries the United States needs as partners to counter Chinese influence in the Arctic, because they refuse to force Greenland to accept American control. He's fracturing the Western alliance in order to pressure Denmark into doing something Denmark has no legal authority to do, since Greenland controls its own natural resources and domestic policy. The result is entirely predictable. European leaders immediately issued a joint statement condemning the tariffs and reaffirming their solidarity with Denmark. France is deploying military assets to Greenland in a show of European unity. Far from isolating Denmark, America has isolated itself. And Greenlandic leaders are watching America threaten their European partners and concluding that the United States is an aggressive, unreliable power that cannot be trusted. If Greenland does eventually achieve independence, why would it align with a country that treated Denmark, Greenland's current partner, with such contempt? Why would Greenlandic leaders trust American promises when they've watched America threaten, bully, and sanction its own allies? The answer is, they wouldn't. But you know who starts looking more attractive? A country that offers economic partnership without military threats. A country with a track record of patient, long-term investment in developing economies. A country that has successfully positioned itself as a partner to nations seeking independence from Western powers. That country is China. Every day Trump continues this approach. He's doing Beijing's work for them. To understand why China is positioned to ultimately win Greenland, you need to understand the timeline Beijing is operating on and how it differs fundamentally from America's approach. American foreign policy, particularly under Trump, operates on a transactional short-term basis. Trump wants results now, a signed deal, a press conference, a victory to announce. If he can't get immediate results, he escalates to threats and coercion. This might work in real estate negotiations, but it fails spectacularly in geopolitics where the other parties are not motivated by quick profits and can't be intimidated into compliance. China, by contrast, operates on a multi-decade timeline. The Communist Party's strategic planning documents literally map out goals for 2035 and 2049. When China invests in a port in Sri Lanka or a mining operation in Zambia, Beijing doesn't expect immediate returns. It's building infrastructure, relationships, and dependencies that will pay strategic dividends 20 or 30 years down the line. This is exactly the approach China is taking with Greenland, and it's devastatingly effective because it aligns perfectly with Greenland's own timeline toward independence. Here's how the Chinese strategy will likely unfold over the next 2 decades, and why it's already too late for America to stop it without fundamentally changing approaches. Phase 1 is the current phase, economic foundation building. This is where China establishes presence through investments, surveys, and partnerships. Even when specific projects get blocked by Danish or American pressure, like the airport construction or the naval base purchase, the offers themselves serve a strategic purpose. They demonstrate Chinese willingness to invest. They build relationships with Greenlandic business and political leaders, and they plant seeds for future cooperation. Chinese companies are currently involved in multiple feasibility studies for mining projects across Greenland. Chinese research institutions collaborate with Greenlandic universities on Arctic studies. Chinese tourism to Greenland is growing. None of these activities individually threatens Danish or American interests, so they proceed quietly without much attention. But collectively, they're establishing deep economic and institutional connections that will be crucial in later phases. Phase 2, which will likely begin in the late 2020s, involves major infrastructure investments as Greenland moves closer to independence. Greenland is actively working toward full independence, likely to be achieved sometime in the 2030s. As independence approaches, Greenland will need to replace that $650 million annual subsidy from Denmark. The only way to do that is by dramatically expanding the economy, which requires massive infrastructure investment: airports, ports, roads, telecommunications, and mining facilities. Here's the crucial question: who will provide that investment? The United States talks about the importance of Greenland but has committed relatively modest development assistance. Tens of millions of dollars, not hundreds of millions or billions. European countries are dealing with their own economic challenges and the massive costs of defending against Russian aggression. They're not particularly interested in spending billions to develop Greenlandic infrastructure. China, however, has demonstrated willingness to invest tens of billions of dollars in far less strategically important locations through the Belt and Road Initiative. When Greenland approaches independence and needs to build 3 new major airports, upgrade port facilities, construct roads connecting mining operations to the coast, and develop telecommunications infrastructure, where will the capital come from? The answer is increasingly likely to be China, either through direct government investment or through Chinese state-owned enterprises and policy banks. Phase 3 involves resource development partnerships as mining operations begin extracting Greenland's rare earth elements, uranium and other minerals. Mining is extraordinarily capital-intensive and technically complex, especially in Arctic conditions. Most Western mining companies are risk-averse and require extensive environmental assessments, regulatory approvals, and guaranteed returns on investment. Chinese companies backed by state support and operating on longer timelines are willing to accept higher risks and lower initial returns in exchange for strategic resource access. As major mining projects in Greenland move forward, Chinese companies and Chinese capital will likely play dominant roles. More importantly, rare earth processing, the crucial step that adds most of the value, will almost certainly involve Chinese facilities, simply because nobody else has the processing capacity. Even if Greenland successfully maintains political independence, and even if minerals are nominally controlled by Greenlandic companies, the practical reality will be that these resources flow through China-dominated supply chains. This gives Beijing de facto control over Greenland's primary revenue source, without requiring political sovereignty. Phase 4 is the dependency lock-in that occurs once China becomes Greenland's primary economic partner. At this point, likely in the 2040 to 2050 timeframe, Greenland is nominally independent, officially non-aligned, and proud of its sovereignty. But its airports were built with Chinese investment. Its mining operations are financed by Chinese banks and operated by companies with major Chinese stakes. Its rare earth exports are processed in Chinese facilities. Its telecommunications infrastructure runs on Chinese equipment. Its primary trade partners are Chinese. Greenland hasn't been conquered or purchased. It's simply become economically dependent on China through a web of investments, debt relationships, and supply chain integration. This is the same pattern we've seen play out across the developing world. Sri Lanka didn't intend to cede control of Hambantota port to China, but when it couldn't repay Chinese loans, it signed a 99-year lease giving China operational control. Pakistan didn't set out to become dependent on Chinese investment, but the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor now involves over $60 billion in Chinese projects that Pakistan cannot afford to repay, giving China tremendous leverage over Pakistani policy. African nations collectively owe over $150 billion to China, creating relationships where Beijing can influence everything from United Nations votes to domestic political decisions. Greenland's trajectory is heading in exactly the same direction. The island desperately needs economic development to achieve and maintain independence. Western nations offer modest assistance but not transformative investment. China offers massive capital with patient repayment terms and few visible strings attached. Greenlandic leaders will take the Chinese money because it's the only realistic path to independence. And 20 years later, Greenland will discover that economic dependence is just as constraining as political colonialism, except it's much harder to escape. The brilliance of China's strategy is that it doesn't require defeating America militarily or even diplomatically. It just requires being more patient, more willing to invest, and more strategic about building dependencies. And on all three dimensions, China is absolutely dominant, while America flails around with threats and tariffs that accomplish nothing except pushing Greenland further into Beijing's orbit. Now let's drill deeper into the rare earth minerals dimension, because this is where the stakes become almost incomprehensibly high and where China's advantage is most overwhelming. Rare earth elements are the oil of the 21st century, the single most critical resource category for advanced technology, military systems, and the entire green energy transition. And just as OPEC's oil dominance shaped geopolitics for decades, China's rare earth dominance will shape the coming century unless something changes dramatically. Here are the hard numbers that should terrify any American strategist. China produces approximately 60% of the world's rare earth minerals, but more importantly, it processes over 90% of global supply. Even rare earths mined in the United States, like those from the Mountain Pass mine in California, get shipped to China for processing because America shut down its rare earth processing facilities decades ago due to environmental concerns and costs. This means that virtually every advanced technology on Earth depends on Chinese processed rare earths. Your smartphone requires 17 different rare earth elements. Every Tesla electric vehicle needs about 45 kilograms of rare earths, primarily for the electric motors. Every wind turbine requires hundreds of kilograms of neodymium and dysprosium for the permanent magnets in the generator. Every F-35 fighter jet needs over 400 kilograms of rare earths for sensors, avionics, and electronic warfare systems. Precision-guided missiles, satellite systems, radar arrays, night vision equipment, all of it depends on rare earth elements. China's dominance of this supply chain gives Beijing a weapon of extraordinary power. If China decided tomorrow to restrict rare earth exports to the United States or Europe, the entire advanced economy would begin grinding to a halt within months. You couldn't manufacture new electric vehicles, smartphones, computers, or military hardware. The green energy transition would stall. Defense production would cease. It would be economic devastation on a scale that makes oil embargoes look minor by comparison. And China has demonstrated its willingness to use this weapon. In 2010, during a territorial dispute with Japan, China temporarily cut off rare earth exports to Japan, causing panic in Japanese manufacturing. In 2019, during the early stages of the US-China trade war, Chinese officials explicitly suggested restricting rare earth exports as retaliation for American tariffs. In April 2025, following Trump's Liberation Day tariffs, China did restrict shipments of several rare earth elements, though they eventually restored them as part of the trade truce. The message is clear. China will weaponize rare earth supply whenever it serves Chinese interests. This brings us back to Greenland. If the United States could develop Greenland's rare earth deposits and establish processing facilities outside Chinese control, it would break China's monopoly and provide supply chain security for critical technologies. This is why Greenland actually does matter for American national security, not because of some vague threat from Russia or China taking over the island militarily, but because Greenland's minerals could provide an alternative to Chinese rare earth dominance. But here's the cruel irony. America's current approach to Greenland virtually guarantees that Chinese companies and Chinese capital will control Greenland's rare earth development. Why? Because Chinese companies are the only ones with the expertise, infrastructure, and risk tolerance to develop rare earth mines in one of the world's most challenging environments. Western mining companies look at Greenland and see massive upfront costs, environmental challenges, regulatory uncertainty, and a decades-long path to profitability. They walk away or demand government subsidies to even consider involvement. Chinese state-owned enterprises look at Greenland and see a strategic asset worth any cost to control. They're willing to invest billions for negative returns in the short term because the long-term strategic value of securing rare earth supplies outside China is borders, which gives them bargaining chips and diplomatic leverage, far exceeds the immediate profit calculation. Look at what happened with Greenland Minerals' Kvanefjeld project, Australian company seeking to develop massive rare earth deposit. Project required approximately $2 billion in investment over a decade. Western investors were skeptical due to environmental concerns and challenging economics. Chinese company Shenghe Resources stepped in as a major shareholder and provided crucial funding. The project ultimately stalled, but the pattern is clear. Chinese capital is willing to go where Western capital won't. Now multiply this pattern across all of Greenland's potential rare earth deposits. As Greenland moves toward independence and seeks to develop its mineral wealth, the primary source of investment will be Chinese. American companies might participate as minority partners, but Chinese firms will hold the major stakes, and Beijing will control the supply chains. This means that even in the best-case scenario where Greenland remains Western-aligned and independent, its rare earth production will flow through Chinese-controlled processing facilities and Chinese-dominated supply chains. America will have gained nothing in terms of supply chain security, but will have spent enormous diplomatic capital and poisoned relationships with European allies in the process. And here's the worst part. This outcome is already essentially locked in. Even if the Trump administration reversed course tomorrow, started offering serious investment instead of threats, and began treating Greenland with respect, it's probably too late. Chinese companies have already established relationships, funded surveys, and positioned themselves for future mining developments. Western companies are years behind and unwilling to commit the necessary capital. The rare earth processing infrastructure exists in China, not in America or Europe, and building new processing facilities would take at least a decade and tens of billions of dollars in investment that nobody seems willing to commit. By the time Greenland achieves independence and begins major mining operations, probably in the 2030 to 2040 timeframe, the dominant economic partner will be China. The supply chains will run through China, and Beijing will have achieved its strategic objective without firing a shot or signing a sovereignty transfer agreement. So let's bring this all together and understand what's really happening in the Arctic, while America's attention is focused on Trump's threats and European protests. The battle for Greenland is not primarily military or even diplomatic. It's economic and strategic, operating on a timescale measured in decades, not months. And by every meaningful metric, China is winning this competition while America is actively sabotaging its own position. China has positioned itself as the patient, reliable partner willing to invest in Greenlandic development without demanding immediate political concessions. Beijing offers infrastructure, mining investment, and economic partnership that aligns perfectly with Greenland's goal of achieving independence from Denmark. This approach is sophisticated, long-term, and devastatingly effective. America, by contrast, has positioned itself as an aggressive, unreliable power that threatens allies, demands territorial acquisition, and offers little beyond military force and economic coercion. Trump's approach has managed to simultaneously offend Greenlanders, alienate European partners, weaken NATO, and strengthen Chinese influence, an almost impressive achievement in strategic incompetence. The tragedy is that America actually does have legitimate interests in Greenland, and those interests could have been advanced through normal diplomacy and economic partnership. Greenland needs infrastructure investment, mining development, and security partnerships. The United States could have provided all of that while respecting Greenlandic autonomy and maintaining alliance relationships with Denmark and Europe. American companies could be major players in developing Greenland's resources. American military facilities could provide security cooperation without demanding sovereignty. American diplomatic support could help Greenland navigate the path to independence. This would have been a win-win scenario where Greenland gets the development it needs, America secures access to critical resources and strategic positioning, and the Western alliance remains intact. Instead, Trump's approach has created a lose-lose scenario where Greenland is pushed toward Chinese influence, European allies are alienated, and American credibility is shattered. And the beneficiary of this strategic disaster is Beijing, which couldn't have designed a better outcome if Xi Jinping himself was writing Trump's speeches. Looking forward, the trajectory is clear. Greenland will continue moving toward independence over the next 10 to 15 years. As independence approaches, Greenland will need massive infrastructure and economic investment that Denmark cannot provide and America is unwilling to offer without political strings attached. China will step in with patient capital, long-term partnerships, and respect for Greenlandic sovereignty, at least nominally. By the time Greenland achieves independence, probably in the 2030s, it will be economically integrated with China through investments, debt, and supply chains. Greenland's rare earth production will flow through Chinese processing facilities. Its infrastructure will be built with Chinese financing. Its primary trade relationships will be with Chinese partners. Greenland will be independent on paper, but economically dependent on Beijing in practice. American and European officials will express concern about Chinese influence, but it will be too late to reverse the dependencies that have been built. And historians will look back at 2026 and wonder how the United States managed to lose the Arctic competition so comprehensively while believing it was winning through shows of strength and tough negotiation. The lesson here extends far beyond Greenland. This is the story of how great power competition actually works in the 21st century. It's not primarily about military force or even traditional diplomacy. It's about economic statecraft, strategic patience, and understanding what your competitors actually need versus what you want to take from them. China understands this. Beijing has built an entire foreign policy apparatus around the Belt and Road Initiative, patient capital deployment, and building dependencies through investment. America, particularly under Trump, seems to have forgotten everything it learned about alliance management, soft power, and strategic patience during the Cold War. We've reverted to a crude form of 19th century imperialism, threatening to take territory by force, imposing tariffs on allies, and believing that loud demands constitute strategy. It doesn't work against sophisticated adversaries like China, who are playing a different, longer game. So while the world watches Trump threaten Denmark and European troops conduct exercises in Greenland, the real story is happening far from the headlines. Chinese officials are quietly meeting with Greenlandic business leaders. Chinese banks are funding feasibility studies. Chinese mining companies are positioning for future projects. Chinese diplomats are building relationships that will pay dividends in 20 years. And by the time Washington realizes what's happened, the Arctic War will already be over. China will have won without most Americans even knowing a battle was fought. The question now is whether America can learn from this strategic failure and adjust its approach before the outcome becomes completely irreversible. It would require abandoning threats in favor of genuine partnership, offering serious investment instead of demands for sovereignty, respecting Greenlandic agency instead of treating the island like property to be bought, and rebuilding trust with European allies instead of alienating them with tariffs and military threats. It would require patient, long-term strategy instead of transactional deal-making. It would require humility instead of imperial arrogance. Based on the current trajectory, none of that seems likely. So prepare for an Arctic future where Greenland is nominally independent but economically controlled by China, where rare earth supply chains remain dominated by Beijing, and where America's strategic position in the Arctic is weaker than it was before Trump decided to make Greenland great again. This is how empires decline, not through military defeat, but through strategic incompetence and the inability to adapt to changing forms of competition. China grasped the rules of 21st century geopolitics. America is still trying to play by 20th century rules. And in Greenland, we're watching in real time as that mismatch produces exactly the outcome you'd expect. China wins, America loses, and most Americans never even realize the game was played.